This is digging in. Again, all those housekeeping items there. This is a series of virtual events from Friends of the National Arboretum, where we welcome experts to discuss exciting topics pertaining to the National Arboretum. Wanted to give you a couple of quick updates from FONA and the Arboretum before we get started. As most of you probably know, FONA is the primary nonprofit of the National Arboretum, where we support the mission of the Arboretum by providing programming and events here at the Arboretum and virtually as well, and at our schools, partner schools around the district as well with their school gardens. We're open every day, 8 to 5, and we ask you to please wear a mask if you're not vaccinated on the grounds, and you'll see I'm wearing my mask today. It is a rule if you're inside of the National Arboretum that you have to mask up. So if you can't hear me, please let me know, but I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Also want to let you know that the National Bonsai and Pinching Museum is open 10 to 4 every day as well, so you can visit the museum if you like. And we did a poll before the event, asked you to answer what fall event you were most looking forward to. And your choices were the bulb sale, forest bathing, or the fall 5K. I think the overwhelming majority of you, at 69%, were looking forward to the bulb sale. I will tell you that I spent all morning pricing with our great volunteers here at FONA, pricing over 16,000 bulbs. So I hope you can join us on Saturday. There's a great selection for you to peruse, and come join us for the bulb sale. Let's see. We also have a fall 5K coming up next Saturday, the 9th. So if you're a runner and want to join us for that, please do. We've got a pretty good crowd coming out, but would love for you to join us as well. And then we have a selection of forest bathing walks throughout the fall too. You can check our website for the schedule there and sign up through the FONA.org website. And then I always would ask you to check out our FONA Field Notes, which is our weekly newsletter, and our membership newsletters as well for more information. If you're not signed up for the FONA Field Notes, you can certainly do that through our website too. As we always mention in these virtual events, we are in the midst of our 50th anniversary of the Washington Youth Garden. A lot of things planned there. We're going to be doing a garden redesign along with some additional signage, and celebrating with our program participants around DC too. If you have questions about the Youth Garden's 50th anniversary, you can go to FONA.org, and there's a special page there. You can learn all about the history and then our plans for the future as well. And then I've talked about this a couple of times, but I want to make sure to keep myself accountable on this and mention it every time I have the opportunity. We are in the midst of working on a canopy trail for the Arboretum, which is a series of tree houses connected by bridges, which will be educational in nature, and it will be down behind the Washington Youth Garden site. We're currently working with the federal government on the approval process, but we are hoping to have a formal announcement around what our timeline is and the construction schedule and all that. But we'll keep you informed on that. But we're making a lot of progress and look forward to sharing a canopy trail with you, hopefully in the next year or so. Okay, we're going to move on to what y'all came here to hear today. And Chris von Kohn, a curator with the National Arboretum, has joined us to talk about the Friendship Garden. Chris has been a curator at the National Arboretum's National Boxwood and Perennial Collection since 2016, the Friendship Garden since 2018, and the Azalea Collection since summer 2019. He previously worked in the Arboretum's research unit studying the genetic diversity of Magnolia ashii to help develop a species conservation plan. Originally from Texas, where he studied horticulture at Texas A&M University, Chris completed a master's degree in plant breeding and genetics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 2014. So with that, I would like to introduce Chris von Kohn, and please give him your attention to hear about the Friendship Garden today. Off to you, Chris.
All right, thank you guys for having me. I'm going to try to start screen sharing. Can you guys see that? Okay, thanks. So when I was still working as a research assistant in Beltsville, I would occasionally listen to NPR while I was doing my my genetics work. And I had listened to an interview with Claudia West and Thomas Rainier about their new book at the time, Planting in a Post-Wild World. And fast forward, I think it was maybe 4 years after that I heard that they were selected as the team to redesign the front portion of the Friendship Garden. So here's their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World, which if you've seen it, great. If you have it, great. If not, I highly recommend it as a great reference for designing plant communities for landscape purposes. Basically, in their book, they talk about their design philosophy, where Claudia West had come from Eastern Germany, where there weren't a whole lot of wild spaces, and basically reclaiming what was once sort of run down, maybe urban spaces, and talking about nature coming back in and reclaiming those areas. Whereas Thomas was talking about what remained after, I believe, some farms were sold and whatnot, and urbanization kind of encroaching into natural spaces, and basically coming up with this concept of not necessarily native purism when it comes to designing new landscapes, but rather a compromise of what native species and introduced plants will work well in the same space together, kind of accentuating each other, but really functioning together as a plant grouping in a design setting. So here's Claudia. When we were first laying out plants as part of the redesign process back in 2019, probably in mid-May. A few notes from the book. Thomas's perspective is one of nature lost versus Claudia's view of nature regained. And one of my favorite quotes from that book was, "When plants themselves are allowed to follow their own destiny, to self-design their own community, more robust plantings will follow." So in this talk, I'll talk about a little bit about the design principles, the establishment of the garden before and during, not after, because this garden is, and many gardens are never really truly done. You'll see a before and an after shot, but this one is really one that's designed to evolve over time. Some of my favorite plants in the garden that I classify as workhorses. Some lessons learned from this whole experience, and then what's next for the garden as it continues to mature. Claudia and Thomas really spent a lot of time trying to evaluate the front of Arbor House as far as what sort of ecotype would it represent in a more natural setting, and kind of landed on this open, like oak woodland to oak savanna setting, and kind of styled the garden after what the space resembled, and really went from there. So from this concept of, their primary concept is you have, in nature, you never really have bare soil. If it's been recently disturbed, it will be, but it won't be long before you see plants emerging and you really see kind of this full green space, no matter where it is. If it's a parking lot, if it's maybe even cracks in concrete, you have something green and growing. And those design concepts were all centered around the concept of a friendship garden, with the friendship garden being a friend to the Chesapeake Bay, a friend to the environment, a friend to pollinators, and friend to gardeners. Is a really great resource for inspiration and planting ideas. So they talk about this in detail in the book, so I'll just kind of summarize here. But the focus is the design should not be centered around individuals or individual plants, but rather related populations, of different species that will really work together in a cohesive, like, ecological unit. Stress can be an asset, and in that they really mean that um, sometimes stress in a natural environment can really help to limit the number of weeds and minimize what will grow in that space, because if they can't tolerate the stress, they won't grow there. Cover the ground by layering plants, so you have this functioning green ground cover layer of different species that will weave themselves together over time to naturally suppress the weeds. The fourth thing was to make the design legible. So you want to see a distinct separation between this ground cover layer, seasonal theme plants, and your structural elements being your taller perennials, shrubs, and trees, and really all together to focus more on not maintaining a landscape, but managing it. So here's their like overall just design overview, kind of what it looked like. I don't have a legend here. I think that's maybe on the next page. But you have this sort of green underlayer of everything representing the different sorts of combinations of ground cover plants with different seasonal theme perennials. I think a few annual and biennial species interspersed in these like brighter shades of pink and purple and red. This is essentially the full plant list, and I've gone through and edited it to show everything in black is a native species, either native to DC or the DC region. And some of them are selected cultivars that may have been bred by other people, but are essentially the species themselves are native to our area. And of the 17,000 plugs that went in, I'm not sure if that includes the number of daffodils that were later added. But as a part of our follow-up planting, we added about 5,000 bulbs on top of the 17,000 plugs that went into this garden. And overall, there are about 80% native plants in this garden. So I've mentioned kind of designing in layers. So you have this ground cover layer, different shorter grasses and forbs that will kind of hold the soil in place, shade things at the soil level to prevent some germination by some of the small weed seeds that otherwise need sunlight to germinate. You have a seasonal theme layer that's planted into this sort of ground cover matrix to provide interest at different points throughout the year, and then your structural layer of trees, some shrubs, and some really tall perennials that provide an impact from a distance that at least stems or maybe some of the leaves would still be present throughout the winter. So this photo I took in May of 2019, what it looked like just before any planting took place. Everything had been removed that was part of the original design by Oman van Sweden from I think the 90s. And so we've got most of the plugs laid out here, and some of the small trees before they were planted, before volunteers arrived, I think 2 days later, to help with planting the rest of the plugs. So during the establishment phase of this garden, it was highly maintenance intense, which is intended to be a lot less of a time requirement as the garden got established. But initially there was lots and lots of weeding. I've certainly continued that and would say there's about as much weeding now as there was in the beginning, but I will talk about some of the reasons behind that later. It involved automatic irrigation and hand watering as a combination. And even a few months after we planted the garden, I could tell that some plants were already outperforming others. And so there were some clear winners and losers even even 3 to 4 months after things were planted. So I'm showing a few before and after photos of what it looked like maybe the first year after planting and the second year. So you can kind of see from one year to the next, the size of the plants is certainly they've certainly started to mature by this point. And one of the things I learned after last year was I really should consider cutting grasses back earlier so people can enjoy snowdrops blooming, because here they're a little bit they're kind of hidden by some of the taller grasses that retain some of their green leaves and some of the dead leaves that I did not cut back earlier in the spring. This is what it looked like in June. I'm sorry to say I did not get a photo of it in June of this year, but just as a reminder of how much open space there was the first year after planting versus last year or now. Everything is really filled in pretty nicely, especially in this space. So here we have our planting day back in 2019. Or one intern at the time, Andrew, and George, who's still with us, really working hard to get things in the ground. And it's still amazing to me that of the, I think, 17,000 plugs that went in, 12,000 plugs were planted over the course of 3 days. Now, another aspect of this garden that I've really enjoyed is it doesn't look like the same space if you see it 1 month versus the next month, or sometimes even going from 1 week to the next. You have very different plants blooming in the same space. So over the course of, I think, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, in the early to mid spring, we have golden groundsel in full bloom that then pretty quickly transitions to this bee balm species that's in full flower. And again, going from March into May, it's a pretty huge transformation. Here you just have basically the grasses showing daffodils. And again, I'm hoping to cut things back a little bit earlier this coming spring, so I can see how the snowdrops are performing and hopefully let them show themselves off a little bit more. But here we have a totally different selection of plants blooming in May. Here, this species is a cultivar of blue-eyed grass called lucerne. Probably bloomed for about a month to 6 weeks and was really provided a pretty spectacular display of color amid a lot of the other perennial grasses, Cecularia autumnalis and Deschampsia, which I'm trying to think of what the common name was, and I don't remember. And here's a different vantage point in the garden. And if you have seen the garden, I think you probably understand what I'm saying is when I say it changes from 1 week to the next. Here we were in April. Penstemon digitalis was just starting to emerge, and then a month later was in full flower at about 5 feet tall. I think this was maybe a couple weeks later when a different species of phlox was blooming and the penstemon was just starting to bud out. Here's, I would say this section of the garden has probably been the most successful where it comes to ground cover matrix, really working to help suppress weed species. When I talk about Deschampsia as a workhorse in the garden, this is the species I'm talking about. Doesn't get too tall, but each plant can be maybe 2 feet across and really helps to kind of minimize either the weeds that emerge or at least the weeds that you can see coming up. So this was taken earlier this year, going from March into May. Everything really just kind of exploded, and I think the rain certainly helped that we had this year. So you can see kind of a selection of phlox intermingling with Monarda, but this is probably one of my favorite spaces in this garden. So some of the lessons I've learned as part of this process, plugs grow really, really, really fast. So everything we started out with, aside from the trees, were in nursery flats of anywhere from 20 plants to 72 plants. And some of those went from plugs that were, maybe 2 inches in diameter to full-size plants that were 5 feet tall a year and a half after they were planted. Some weeds aren't weeds if they're useful. So this is really about letting plants work for you rather than you having to work to maintain the plants. And if they work to, say, suppress some of the weeds and don't detract from the overall garden, it's better just to leave them. Well-designed gardens are more resilient. This is kind of going back to having a wider selection of different plants planted together, so that if one species in a certain area doesn't do as well, other species around it will kind of take over and fill in the gaps that are left behind from the plant that is, not as happy. And then one lesson, which has been a really important one for me, is some plants that you intend to plant in the garden can become overly aggressive, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So like I said, we started out with small plugs. In May of 2019, this photo I took in June of 2020 after I was allowed to come back, after we first started opening the Arboretum to additional staff. This pin stem in here was about 5 feet tall from a plug in 13 months. And this Deschampsia cespitosa cultivaris gold tau, those plants went from small plugs about 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter to full-size plants that were 3 feet across in a year. And after we had our initial planting dates back in May of 2019, I went back through and just to make sure everything got planted, and it seemed like even 3 or 4 weeks after those planting days, I would inevitably find a couple plugs that we overlooked and hadn't been planted into the ground. But there were a few of this grass that I found 6 weeks later, not planted, but had just been laid on top of the soil and had sprouted roots and were just growing on top of the soil. So that just speaks to how resilient that particular plant is. And it's one of those that has been really successful throughout the garden in shady spots and in sunny spaces. So here I've got 3 different plants. On the left, there's a native Eupatorium celestinum. I've heard can be a little bit on the aggressive side, but it's a really good plant and provides interest at a time of year when a lot of things are kind of slowing down. So right now, maybe it's past its peak bloom, but it was in peak bloom about 1.5 to 2 weeks ago. Here in the middle, you can see this sort of fine textured, grassy looking plant. This was not planted in the garden intentionally, but kind of came in on its own. It's a native rush. The species is Juncus tenuis. And when I first saw it, I was like, it's not too tall. You don't really notice it from a distance. And if I let this plant grow, something else that might be a little bit more aggressive won't be able to take that space. And so I contacted the designer and I was like, hey Claudia, I've got this plant that's kind of coming up. It seems to sort of match with this philosophy of a ground cover layer. Should I leave it? Should I pull it? And she's like, it's a great plant. It doesn't tolerate a lot of competition, but in the early phase of this garden would be useful, as it will kind of naturally suppress some other weeds. So you'll see it still in the garden in different spaces, particularly along the edge where there's have been some bare spots. And on the right, with the history of this garden having been planted with annuals, especially along the border, um, every now and then you'll see a remnant seed from those plantings kind of pop up. And I just didn't have the heart to remove this petunia. And sometimes it may be a little violet or angelonia, but they just kind of add to the garden for me, make me smile whenever I see them. And I'd much rather see that than some of the more problematic weeds, because I know that's never going to take over. So in the front of this garden, this is one of the problem spaces I've been trying to deal with in the last couple of years. We had planted this species called Pachyra obovata, which is a golden groundsel, which we have two species of that in that genus planted in this garden. This one has not seemed to tolerate full sun as well as the other species. It does have smaller leaves, maybe an inch to 2 inches long, and should have been a large component of this ground cover matrix in the front of this bed, which is in the front center of in front of the arbor house. This was May of 2019 versus probably March and April of 2020. But fast forward to end of last summer, most of those plants did not survive, partially because of the heat and the humidity and some of the rainfall issues we'd had. But there also seems to be a sort of root fungus that has affected a number of plants in the garden and hit especially hard in this front section that really gets baked by the full afternoon sun. So one of the lessons I learned was some plants are clear winners, some not so much, as was the case with this golden groundsel. But as I've said before, well-designed plant communities are resilient and can kind of heal themselves. So, I mean, that does take work to go and hand weed these spaces, but a lot of the violets that were included as part of the garden had really started to germinate in these open areas and are kind of forming their own ground cover matrix that wasn't necessarily designed to be predominantly violets, but that's what the garden is doing. And so I'm trying to help that process along. On the other end of the spectrum, some plants do a little bit better, and by a little bit better, I mean a lot better than they were anticipated. So this is what the garden looked like maybe last week. You can kind of see this really tall grass with its purple seed heads. And initially we had planted 100 plugs of this grass. I have since this year pulled out by hand, with the help of a couple volunteers, 2 truckloads of this grass, because it seeds very heavily and will germinate very well in any space of bare soil that it can find. And as I said, with like in this space, that grass really has taken over, and I'm trying to win that battle, but it's a long process. And so I'm still working to try to find some substitutes for that Pachyra that didn't do well in the space to kind of complement the violets. But I really wish that this grass had never been included in that design, because it has been we thought it would be an asset, but it's really added to the challenges I face in this garden. Earlier, I mentioned the Shamsia cespitosa as a plant that really did well in multiple spaces in the garden. And so this is just kind of a list of those plants that have done really well and help with suppressing weeds. in the garden. So Pachyra aurea is that golden groundsel that has a little bit larger leaves. Some warned me that it might be a little bit of a thug, but I've not seen that. I've maybe seen a handful, maybe a couple dozen plants that have seeded themselves into the garden from adjacent areas, but it's really kind of helping to fill in the gaps where other plants didn't do as well. Phlox digitalis has really attractive flowers in maybe May and June, but also kind of fits into that sort of ground cover matrix, because the rest of the year, when it's not flowering, it can have a very dense mat of basal foliage that can take up maybe 2 feet from one side to the other, and kind of really help suppress some of the weedy species, or even that grass, Tridens flavus, that I've been trying to pull out. I've already mentioned the violets that have kind of seeded themselves around in that garden. And in your landscape, it's a plant that would maybe show itself as almost a lawn weed, but has really attractive deep purple flowers in the early spring, and the rest of the year it kind of just blends into the background. Ceslaria autumnalis is known as autumn moorgrass, and if you look at the arbor house from the road, there's a large mass of it planted underneath some of the sweet gums. It's really provides a great dense ground cover that I almost never have to weed. Maybe once or twice a year I'll go through and pull out a few of the vines that have come up in between it, but it's probably one of the better plants that I've got out there as far as creating a large, dense area that I don't have to worry about too much. There are some other plants in this garden that I've really enjoyed. So I'm just showing here winter foliage of Lysimachia purpurea that has later in the summer really bright golden flowers, but in the winter provides this nice purple ground cover, and then once it starts to grow in the spring, a different textural component to the garden. And here I'm just showing some of the various plant communities throughout this garden. So on the left side here, we've got a cultivar of coral bells interplanted with Deschampsia and Ceslaria autumnalis with this Viola striata that really work well together. With some different textural contrast, but every bit of green in here kind of matches with the other. Nothing clashes too much. And from their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World, there was some discussion on contrasting colors versus complementary colors. And a lot of times if you plant something that's got like this really silvery gray green foliage with something that's really lush and chartreuse green, they may grow well together, but they're not from similar areas. So when you plant them in a garden space, they don't look as cohesive as this community here. In the middle, you've got that golden groundsel with the Viola cerurea, that purple sort of lawn violet, if you will, that provides a really nice sort of purple and gold theme in maybe March and April, followed by Monarda bradburyina with with the lighter green of the coral bells. This is one of my favorite plants in the garden. I have a lot, let's be honest. This is Erigeron pulchellus cultivaris Lynnhaven carpet. And I like the flowers because they're kind of a nice surprise, but really those flowers are just a bonus to what it does as far as weed suppression. And I'll show you in a couple slides what the foliage looks like the rest of the year. Just kind of a shot of a few plants that were blooming maybe in June. This Stachys monieri homelo, which is a close relative of lamb's ear, with Sisyrinchium lucerne, and the foliage of one of the milkweed species, a purple milkweed, which for the first year of that the garden was getting established, I was not sure if this plant would survive because the monarch caterpillars ate everything to the ground, but it fortunately rebounded fairly quickly. So I mentioned the flowers of this plant were really a bonus. But they have these really broad, hairy leaves, form pretty dense rosettes in spring, summer, and fall, and persist through winter. Not a whole lot of seeds will germinate and grow through this plant, and if they do, they're fairly easy to pull. But you can see, like, there's no bare soil, no need for mulching around that plant, which really makes my life a little bit easier. And given the amount of space I manage at the Arboretum, I will take every bit of that that I can get. And this plant seems fairly resilient. I wouldn't plant it in full blazing sun, but as long as it has some shade throughout the day, it generally does pretty well. I think here, the plant's getting a little bit more shade, so the leaves are a little bit larger, whereas in more sun, the leaves are a little bit smaller, a little bit more dense. There's some space in between plants, but I believe over time this will fill in a little bit better. One of the plants that this was planted with did not make it, or it was really struggling, so this plant is kind of still filling in those gaps. I mentioned Pachyra aurea would seed itself around, and here it popped up on its own. The seed blew in from elsewhere in the garden. This is Deschampsia cespitosa, what it looks like in full sun. It'll look a little bit burned out this time of year, but it's still growing. It's still doing fine. It will recover a little bit later in the fall. But I wanted to show this space because you can kind of see opportunistic plants that have kind of seeded themselves in whatever gaps they can find. This white flower here is a little bit out of focus, but that is a native euphorbia species that was planted elsewhere in the garden that kind of seeded in to fill empty space. I'm sure I'll find it in between cracks in the bricks later on, but that's not really a problem. This I took last week after trying to remove a lot of the taller Tridens flavus that had kind of seeded itself in here. But I wanted to show this photo in particular because you can see all of this black-eyed Susan that's scattered throughout this bed. We planted 17,000 plugs, but that Rudbeckia was not one of those plants that we put into that garden. It was a remnant from the previous design, and seeds had persisted in the soil and then sprouted after this whole garden was planted. And I've really kind of left them. I'm not going to let them take over because I know they will. So after they flower, before they go to seed, I'll be pulling a lot of those out. But they also form a really nice, dense rosette of foliage during the fall and winter months that can kind of help suppress some of those annual weeds in particular. So it's kind of a nice contrast to the other asters that are flowering in here and prolongs the season of interest and just adding a different component to the overall effect of the garden, even though it wasn't necessarily designed that way. So what is next for this garden? It's designed to change over time, and so a lot of the tree species that we had planted, or a lot of the individual trees we planted in the garden were fairly small, which over time will get a lot larger, so the garden will become a little bit shadier. So some of those plant species will shift from sun-loving perennials or short-lived perennials to a little bit more shade-tolerant species. I'm really trying to work slowly to apply some of these design principles, especially having that sort of ground cover matrix and like living mulch to the back portion of the garden to hopefully reduce the amount of maintenance and time that I have to spend out in the back trying to maintain those mulched areas. I'm working on some alternatives for the Pacra obovata that had not worked well in the front of the garden. And some things will be added, some things will probably, you know, disappear over time. But I'm working to try to find something that will fill the gap that that plant left, and add some more spring ephemeral plants and maybe some more bulbs over time, just to kind of keep things changing in that space. So this is Sedum matrona, really sun-loving perennial, and a fairly shady spot in the garden. It did fine for its first year and its second year, but it seems like it's dwindling a little bit over time. And this plant is Porteranthus trifoliatus. I don't remember the common name. I should probably write it down for myself to remember. But the first year in the garden, it was a small plug. The second year was still there, but I didn't really notice it until spring of this year when it was finally large enough to bloom and be about 2 feet tall. The previous years, it was maybe 6 to 8 inches, so it really blended in with everything else and I couldn't see it. So I mentioned a couple of spring ephemerals. Joan Feely shared this shooting star, Dodecathion species, that she had been growing in the greenhouse, I think, since I arrived at the Arboretum back in 2015 or 14. And I planted that in the garden early this spring when it was still flowering. So I'll see how those come back next year. Hopefully it will seed around a little bit, so there will be some more of it in years to come. And I just like this combination of Quamash or Camassia with the golden groundsel still blooming in April. And of course, tiger swallowtail enjoying the flowers of Phlox paniculata Gina, which was selected by the Mount Cuba Center as the most pollinator attractive cultivar of phlox in their trials several years back. And a couple shots I've taken this Polyphemus moth male on one of the garden benches, snowdrops in the spring, and then this monarch caterpillar on butterfly weed. That said, I will be happy to take any questions you all have. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for having me here. Can you guys open it for questions?
Yep. Chris, we've got some questions. First, I want to thank you and the volunteers for all your work on the garden. I mean, we're able to come in and enjoy it regularly. And I would tell you that, you know, coming in regularly allows us to appreciate all the change that happens with the garden over time. And seeing all your pictures, you know, brings back some memories of, you know, coming into the Arbor House. I just want to make sure I take a moment to just say thank you to you and all the volunteers that work on the garden. I know that it takes some work, but obviously we greatly appreciate it here at FONA. So thank you. Okay, a good presenter you are, Chris, because you anticipated some of the questions that came up. But let's see here. You mentioned some of the plants that were winners and some of the weeds that were not actually weeds to the garden. Is there anything else you could expand on there, or do you feel like you covered the winners and the weeds that were not weeds?
So I mean, I didn't really talk about it a whole lot, but there are some plants that at some times of the year are winners, and later in the year they're not. There are some annual aster species. Usually, like in the spring and summer, you'll see like these tall plants with maybe 3 feet tall, daisy-like flowers. It's technically a weed, but I kind of leave it there because in the winter it forms this dense basal foliage that will kind of choke out some of the other less desirable annual weeds. But like that perennial native rush was one of those non-weed weeds. And I didn't include a photo of it. I intended to, but there was one species that's that's a native annual that has really small, almost cat or not, it's almost catmint-like flowers, but are kind of maybe a quarter to half an inch and nearly like a purple blue. I'm hoping that I'm hoping to maybe propagate it and kind of spread it around a little bit. But it was a nice surprise to kind of see when I was pulling out the really aggressive grass, purple top, Tridens flavus, grass that had kind of tried to take over.
Okay.
Did that answer the question, or was there another follow-up with that?
Well, it was just around the winters and the weeds, but I think you covered that pretty well. Okay, how were the plugs sourced, and were some house grown?
We tried to grow one of the species of grass on site, and out of like I think we ended up planting like 50 flats of seed. Had maybe 5% germination rates, and in trying to get those plugs to grow, they became more weed than intended grass. And not all of the grasses that came up in those flats looked like each other. So we just nixed that entire species from the planting because we couldn't find it anywhere commercially. And the rest of it, a lot of our plugs came from North Creek Nurseries. Claudia West at one point, I believe, worked for North Creek and was familiar with a lot of the plants in the design from her work there. Others came from, I think a few came from maybe Cavanas, but North Creek was the probably biggest source of perennial material. And as far as the grasses were concerned, those mainly came from Hoffman Nursery, which specializes in grasses.
Okay. Is the native euphorbia also called foam flower or hardy ageratum? My start from my grandmother has taken over the entire garden, but it is a welcome bloomer this time of year, a true workhorse.
So are you talking about like the sort of blue flower, like the lavender, purple, blue flower, or the white one?
Michael, I'm not sure. Michael, do you, since you're the one that asked that question, do you want to expand on that one?
The blue purple.
Did I say that was euphorbia? If I said euphorbia, I didn't mean to. That's a eupatorium species. The euphorbia that I mentioned that was coming up in the like near the edge of the garden, that was a euphorbia. But there are multiple species of native eupatorium, one with white flowers that I believe can be called foam flower, that you see kind of everywhere in the meadows. There's quite a bit of it in one particular section in the Boxwood collection that is native. It can seed quite readily, and with the amount of space I had to deal with and the amount of weeds and rain we had this year, that white flowered eupatorium actually outgrew a boxwood, such that I didn't see the boxwood until I tried to go through and pull some of that eupatorium out.
Okay.
By the way, there was a question there on foam flower. That is Tiarella.
Okay, we do not have Tiarella as part of the front garden. It was intended for the redesign of the back part of the garden, but for the most part, that plant did not do well where it was planted. I think it was a little bit too dry.
Okay. Got a question here from Gail. What was the middle of the I guess the third pick of a purple flower at the end of the group of 3 pictures? So I'm not sure. We might want to look back at the presentation there.
Share screen. Here we go. Was it this one? Oh, I don't know what I just did.
That's good. Gail, is that the one you're looking at?
That's the one. What was that?
That is Stacky's Humelo. Humelo is the cultivar. I will type that into the chat.
That would be helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Next question is, do you steal from the nursery? Do they love Joan Feely's contribution?
Did I steal from the nursery?
Yep.
No, she was happy to share that because she had a flat of the Dodecatheon in one of the poly houses, I think for the last at least 5 years. And she asked me if I wanted to plant that as part of the friendship garden. I was like, I took her up on it.
Okay.
I thought it would be a
The
really
deal
great.
was in quotes. I didn't want to infer that you actually stole it, but there you
I
go.
can't say that I haven't taken seeds home on occasion. But if it's something that has like 5,000 seeds, I don't feel too badly.
There you
I
go.
will not be taking seeds of the tridents home at all, at least not intentionally.
And then, is it possible to obtain a list of all the plants in the friendship garden?
Let me see if I can try to let me get out of there. I can at least do this.
Chris,
I'm going to try to take a screenshot of this one slide to then upload.
Chris, we've got the planting plan in our database. If you're okay, from Phyto Studios, I can share that out in the.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I think I sent that to Kathy Kirkham at one point.
Mhm.
So yes, that would be definitely better than just a screenshot of this.
Yeah, we're happy to share that with everyone.
Okay.
Great. All right, we've got one more question here. Did the designers plan for any species that you nixed because you knew they would be invasive or felt would not do well in the DC area? And do you normally take a design and follow it verbatim, or do you talk things over with the designers to do substitutions?
Yes. There was one, I can't remember which it was, and I was like, I think that would be a little bit invasive. And so the grass species that we had tried to propagate at the Arboretum was one that I read about, and it said it could become aggressive and 3 and 4 feet tall. And I was rather happy that it didn't propagate very easily. And when I got rid of those flats, I was not sad about it by any means. In the back, by like right in front of the AC units, initially Claudia had spec'd a switchgrass cultivar, Northwind, for that space. And that was one I was familiar with from the boxwood collection, planted as a fairly large mass in one of the beds. And while it can be a great plant, I find the cultivar name to be a little bit ironic because it's named Northwind, but it seems like that cultivar always gets blown to the ground whenever we have like a really windy, like a storm or strong north winds. It just doesn't tolerate the windy conditions and remain upright. And in that space, I have to go through there to access the irrigation panel, which is right behind the AC unit. And when I was like, can we maybe switch that out with something that's a little bit more upright, a little bit less spreading? And she was quite amenable to some of those suggestions. And because she's based in Pennsylvania, some of her experiences with certain cultivars in Pennsylvania wouldn't necessarily translate even to DC or a similar climate, but just different enough that some things like she had initially suggested grape hyacinth as one of the bulbs to go in the garden. And she didn't, from my experience here, in the winter, it can look a little bit ratty because the foliage comes up early in the fall, will persist throughout the winter, but whenever we have hard freezes, that will show frost damage and isn't necessarily the most attractive. And so when I told her that, she was happy to substitute that with one of the blue like woodland squill instead.
Okay, one more question, then we'll let you get on with your day. But Did the plant design include any bulbs? I know you just mentioned one, but if so, will it be on sale at the bulb sale this Saturday? So if you can tell me if there are any bulbs, I can do some research and see if we have it in our inventory.
There are definitely some daffodil cultivars that were in that design. I don't know if you have Howera was one of the cultivars.
Okay, I'd have to, I'm not sure. I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but we certainly do have some daffodils.
Sun Disc was another one which I really like because it flowers a little bit later for like later or at the end of the daffodil season, and has really small flowers about the size of a quarter that are really kind of a buttery yellow, and kind of because they're so late for daffodils, they kind of are a little bit of a transitional cultivar, going from daffodils to some of the early spring flowering perennials that are usually after bulb season. But that one's great. Jetfire was probably the one that you would have seen in some of the photos with yellow petals and then an orange trumpet. That cultivar is done really well. And I know I think you guys probably have tete-a-tete in the bulb sale, and that's one that does really well here. It is among the earliest flowered daffodils. I don't think that's in the Friendship Garden itself, but it's one that I really enjoy because it is it's a smaller daffodil, really short, maybe 6 inches tall, and unlike some of the taller standard daffodils, as tete-a-tete fades and the foliage kind of dies back, you don't really notice it because at that point other things have kind of grown taller and will kind of hide it from view.
Okay. Well, I will try to do some research between now and the bulb sale, but those that are coming to the bulb sale, come see me and I'll let you know which ones are we have in inventory. Okay. Well, I have to thank Chris von Kohn for joining us today, curator of the.
Bill's got a question.
Matt, what you got?
Craven, I just want to say on behalf of the FONA board that this is an excellent presentation. And it seems to me there are a great many lessons here for us to be looking at in the context of some of our projects, including Springhouse Run, which is getting very, very heavily overrun, but where a certain amount of effort could retain the natural system, but at the same time allow for more access and more ability to actually see what's going on there. Anyway, great job.
Thank you.
I concur.
Very much.
And Matt and I will be walking around the Arboretum, I believe, next week to discuss some of these environmental projects. And appreciate you highlighting some things we should think about, Chris. And appreciate you giving us time. Obviously, we love showcasing the work you do at the Arboretum with our stakeholders. And again, very kind of you to take the time today. Okay, before I let everybody go, just want to remind you about the bulb sale this weekend on Saturday. It'll be at the New York Avenue entrance. So come by there, starting up at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, and then our 5K the following Saturday, October the 9th as well. We'll have a staggered start there, so you can come out that morning and run with us if you like. Obviously, if you don't get FONA field notes, you have the opportunity to sign up through our website. You can do that at FONA.org. And then also keep out for future digging in sessions. And then you'll also be getting a survey for today's session. So any feedback that you have would be greatly appreciated. We want to make sure we're offering sessions that are interesting to you. So please give us your feedback on this session today. Okay, hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again for your support of FONA and for attending Digging In. And we hope to see you, if not at the bulb sale, in the next Digging In we have, but come on out to the Arboretum and visit us. And thanks again for the time.